Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Thursday, March 27th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David.
Hey, Jessica.
Early this morning, Israel's coalition voted to change the makeup of the Judicial Selection Committee, passing the highly controversial bill. Opposition Knesset members left the plenum in protest and then vowed to repeal the new law. We'll talk about what all of that means, the ongoing protests, as well as, on a different front, protests seemingly against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Stay with us. Okay, David. So the legislation that has been in the works for months and months, and that opposition MKs, for instance, say actually led to October 7th, the protest against it, that is, finally passed, and it was done early this morning. You, of course, wrote about it in an op-ed yesterday, and now that this moment is here, I want to hear what you're thinking about.
Okay, so first of all, the legislation has been in the works since basically the coalition took office, which is more than 2 years ago. But it's not the exact same legislation, and I'll clarify that in a second. And in terms of, opposition MPs do not say that October 7th happened because of this, but they, in common with the then former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, argue that division over all the package of judicial overhaul, which is basically a package that would completely strip the judiciary of independence and leave the Supreme Court essentially neutered and subjugated to the political echelon. They have said that the divisions over that were so contentious within Israel and that the rifts extended into the security services and the army, and that enemies were emboldened. And in that respect, they consider, October the 7th to have been, I think it's clear that Hamas was planning October 7th before this government took office, right? We've seen their plans. But as a contributory factor and as an emboldening factor and as a factor that weakens Israeli society. And the last of those is emphatically still the case. In other words, this legislation now going through is tremendously divisive, and it is preoccupying Israelis. And it is definitely, in my opinion, a weakening of Israeli democracy. Having said that, we should clarify a few things that are really important to understand about this legislation, one of which is that it doesn't take effect until after the next elections. And therefore, when people go to the polls, which, please God, will proceed as meant to happen in a democracy, and there's no reason to think that won't be the case, they're due in October 2026, and people will be voting. And among the factors they will take into account is, hey, there's this legislation that passed, and who knows what other legislation may yet be advanced, because the coalition can get anything through the Knesset now. It's a 68-strong coalition out of 120 Knesset members. It can get stuff through. People will know that they are voting, and if they return a similar-minded coalition, this legislation will take effect. Now, it is not the original law on this issue that was mooted by Justice Minister Yariv Levin. His original intention was legislation in which basically to cut through all the nuance. So I apologize for doing that. The coalition would choose the justices of the Supreme Court. It's not as simple as that, but that was, broadly speaking, what the effect would have been of the original legislation. This is not that. This is legislation, and the wording is really important, in which essentially the political echelon, the Knesset, the coalition and the opposition have massively increased influence over the choice of all judges in the Israeli judicial hierarchy, including in the Supreme Court. And what this means is, including because of some of the provisions of this law, that there's this oversight of politics in the system. And the concern is not only, and we'll get onto that in a second, about who becomes a justice in the Supreme Court, but also about what judges all the way through the system have to now think, or try not to think, when they're making their rulings, because they know that their advancement to a considerable extent is in the hands of the political echelon. So if they make a decision that they are ruling that they think, oh, that's going to really upset or really please this or that political element, notably including the government, the coalition, they either have to put that out of their minds, or if they're cynical and career-minded and not too obsessed with doing their job properly, then the danger is that they would rule in that way. In terms of the actual mechanics of it, when, as I think is inevitable, the newly constituted Judicial Selection Committee, in which the Bar Association no longer has any representatives at all, and when the coalition and opposition representatives are deadlocked, each of them, and there are 2 vacancies on the Supreme Court, each of them is permitted to submit a list of 3 candidates for a Supreme Court seat, and the other side has to choose one of them. I hope that's clear. It's complicated. So the coalition would submit 3 candidates that it wants on the Supreme Court. The opposition would submit its 3, and each of the 2 sides there would have to choose one of each other's lists. In other words, the temptation, the natural consequence even, is that you will want to install justices on the Supreme Court who reflect your political ideology. And just one more thing, Jess, and I know I'm speaking at great length, so forgive me. People say, yeah, but lots of judicial systems have that political element. Look at the American system, which is a very politicized process for choosing Supreme Court justices and so on. Among the differences here that are really very crucial is, one, we have no constitution, and therefore the only absolute guarantor of majority and minority rights against abuse by the political majority is the judiciary, all the way up to the Supreme Court, number one. And number two, we don't have 3 branches of government in Israel, really. We have an executive and a judiciary. The legislature, as we saw, simply by the way this law was passed, it cannot stop a coalition of unified mindset. Now, this, part of this legislation is under the rubric of basic law, which people describe as, Israel's quasi-constitutional basic laws. But they do not require a special majority to pass. It's not as though you have to have wide consensus to get a basic law passed because it's so foundational and so affects the way Israel is governed. No, you just need a simple majority, as we saw, 67-1. And it sails through. And therefore, the ease with which the political echelon can change fundamental aspects of how Israel is governed is a tremendous vulnerability. And if the legislation that's being pushed through is drastically weakening the only other brake on the political majority, which is the judiciary, then this is cause for acute concern. And that's why there is so much concern.
Okay, so then the next question that comes to my mind is, and it's something that I hear a lot of discussions about, this sense of, then why now? 59 remaining hostages, back to war in Gaza, so much else happening. And here we are back to these very aspects of legislation that had really embittered Israeli society and divided Israeli society. So it might seem obvious, but I want to ask you that.
No, I don't think it's obvious, and I think it's unfathomable, and I think it's an entirely legitimate question for which there is no good answer, because it is so obviously destructive. Even if you believe that, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said in the Knesset, that the justices are defying the will of the people and so on, the process is so corrosive that you would think that it would be a cardinal interest for a government of Israel to lay it aside for the time being, try to find compromise and so on. But the power of the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary and the efficiency of the judiciary is a tremendous thorn in their side. That's a massive understatement. They're trying to legislate, for example, to keep the coalition together, that there will be enshrined in law a broad exemption from military service of the ultra-Orthodox community. The Supreme Court will strike that down. They're gearing up. They've passed a vote to fire the Attorney General. I think it's entirely possible that the Supreme Court would try to not have them do that, because they would argue that that is a role whose independence is very important, and that the coalition doesn't like her because she's telling them what is legal and what is permissible in Israel. She, for example, has told them it is not legal to legislate an unequal, undemocratic law that keeps the ultra-Orthodox excluded from military service. So everything about judicial independence, when you are pushing legislation that the judges will tell you cannot and should not advance, causes problems for the coalition, and therefore they have resumed this judicial overhaul agenda. And we should stress that they're not done yet. If at this point you have to take seriously, when the government talked about there were rumors they're going to fire the head of the Shin Bet, when there were rumors that they were seeking to oust the Attorney General, these gradually moved from the realm of rumor to the realm of practical decision making. So Yariv Levin, soon after the government took office, at the very beginning of January 2023, said, here's this package of legislation. Included in it was the Judicial Selection Committee overhaul. Down the road, he has said he wants to limit the areas in which the Supreme Court can apply judicial oversight to laws and legislation and government decisions. He has said that he wants to have special majorities that would be required on the Supreme Court, without which a ruling against the government would not take effect because the majority on the bench would not be sufficiently wide. He has said he wants to legislate whereby if the Supreme Court somehow, with all those limitations, strikes down a law or a decision, the Knesset could simply re-legislate such a law. So they're not done yet. And you have to assume, because you see this happening, that the goal of radically reducing the capabilities of the Supreme Court is going to continue to be pursued. And one last thing that we should stress, Jessica, in the international context, one of the reasons, I mean, the international legal community, I think you could say as a generalization, has been spectacularly critical of Israel. We see genocide cases in The Hague. We see arrest warrants issued for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and so on. One of the relative defenses that perhaps has made things slightly less bad, and that perhaps means that ultimately, internationally, in a climate where you have a new administration in the United States, means that Israel might be less pressured internationally. One of the reasons for that is the independence of Israel's Supreme Court. When you have a Supreme Court, when you have a judiciary that is manifestly no longer capable and reliably independent, then international legal action against Israel and all kinds of potential sanction and punishment and so on becomes more likely, because Israel will get to the stage where is no longer deemed to be genuinely capable of overseeing the proper enactment, the proper implementation of law and legal principles. That's another additional danger stemming from this legislation.
Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, let's talk about protests, both here and in Gaza. Stay with us. Okay, so then not on the heels, really, trying to prevent all of this, there has been this swell of protests around the country. The focus has been in Jerusalem for more than a week, leading up to these votes. First, about the firing of Shin Bet Chief Ronen Bar, always about the hostages. They've sort of been rolled into one. And then as this legislation was coming to pass in the plenum, that was also where you saw thousands of people outside the Knesset last night. And it's interesting because I follow a lot of the protests. It's pretty quiet on the protest front today. Whereas they blocked Route 1 into Jerusalem yesterday, there's none of that happening right now. Of course, as you and I discussed briefly before we started recording this morning, that's because, the vote has taken place and the protests are clearly not preventing it, as if they ever were going to, right? That was always the big question mark. And opposition MKs, opposition Knesset members joined the protesters last night, some of them. And the protests, of course, we should also say, this all started in January 2023 when this coalition government was voted in, and when Yariv Levin, the justice minister, put forth his plans. And that's when the street protests started up really at that point. So what do we think is ahead of us in that sense? Where does the Israeli public go now? What do they do now?
So the protests really had an impact 2 years ago. It's almost the 2-year anniversary to the day. It's around this. Yoav Gallant gave his speech about warning that the divide was posing a tangible threat to Israeli security. He gave that speech on March the 25th, and we're now 2 days later. Netanyahu backtracked because of the protests. He fired Gallant, and then he backtracked, and then largely froze the legislation. And I think a big factor in that was huge protests. When Gallant gave his speech and Netanyahu fired him, it's very, very hard to know how many people are turning out to demonstrations. And we tried to give it as accurate a picture as possible. It's very, very hard to know. But it has been widely reported, including by us, that hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated 2 years ago. There have not been demonstrations of that order at any time in the last year and a half, as far as I can recall. We think there were maybe something like 100,000 people demonstrating last weekend. And that was a combination, as you say, and this is a real factor, Jessica, I think, of protests on behalf of the hostages, protests asserting that Netanyahu has foregone an opportunity to get more living hostages out and ordered a return to the campaign, in part because of coalition pressure and the far right in his coalition demanding a return to war and demanding that he not go through to the second phase of the agreement, the hostage ceasefire terrorist released package that Israel agreed to in January. So they're mixed in. Anti-government protesters are mixed in, and demonstrators further to the left demanding partnerships and two-state solutions and Palestinian statehood and so on. All sorts of people with all kinds of agendas naturally are demonstrating. I think Netanyahu has, in an era where President Trump was elected and does not appear unduly fazed by tremendous opposition to some of his moves, I think some of that has rubbed off pretty clearly on Netanyahu. And we've even had reporting with people saying that they indeed, people, well-placed people indicating that they believe that that's the case. This time, the fact is that for whatever reason, the coalition, the government, the prime minister were not deterred from going through with this legislation, maybe because the stakes are higher, because their capacity to legislate their agenda and move forward with their coalition issues could not really sit and will not stand against a genuinely independent judiciary, and therefore they may feel a tremendous imperative to go through with this legislation, maybe more greatly than was the case 2 years ago. So that might be a factor. And they may also bank on the fact that the public, after so long, battling so long and so deep in a war, is tired. I mean, I think the opposition politicians have been fairly disorganized and ineffectual. The Histadrut, the main trade union labor federation in Israel, I think they were meeting last night to discuss whether to hold a national strike, and maybe they will and maybe they won't. I think
hasn't the moment passed?
Exactly, that the ship has sailed. That would be bolting the stable door if they were going to hold a national strike because they believed that this process was terribly damaging for Israel. The time to be discussing it was not, as the Knesset was going through the voting process. So all of those, I think, are factors in the timing and in terms of what happens next. I think if you took any issue, if you were to look at one issue that is, parts of the opposition to the government are very polarizing. There are all sorts of polls. How much of the public wants a state commission of inquiry? An overwhelming majority. Firing the head of Shin Bet, more divisive, still a plurality. The question of whether the Attorney General is being fired for substantive or narrow coalition reasons. Lots of majorities which are not comfortable for the government. But the one issue, I think, on which there is vast consensus in Israel is that it is no longer tenable, if ever it was, to exclude from military service the fastest growing community in Israel at the same time as the taxpayer is subsidizing them. 13% of the Israeli public is Haredi. Last time I checked, the number is going up. If you look at birth rates within the community, you can see that this is by far the fastest growing community in Israel. And to have a situation where they are not pulling their weight with any kind of national service. There was an argument, serving in the army is a direct threat to a Haredi lifestyle. I think it's pretty clear the army has taken far-reaching steps to try and make that not the case. The outgoing chief of staff spoke about setting up yeshivas on the Jordan border so that people could study in yeshiva and help patrol and guard that border. There is a desire in the army to make it non-threatening, or as non-threatening as possible for a Haredi lifestyle, to at the same time fulfill military service, and there are all kinds of programs for national service. I think the desire to oppose this process is incredibly widespread in the modern Orthodox community, in the religious Zionist community. There is acute unhappiness. This is a community that believes that its interpretation of Judaism and Jewish values and Zionism and mutual sharing of a burden is a fair and accurate understanding of what Judaism would want done. And they see what the ultra-Orthodox community and its leaders are demanding as a perversion of Orthodox Judaism. There, I think that, the public sense of outrage is incredibly widespread. So I don't know if that is going to become a kind of unifying issue. I do think that's, if I was the government, I would know that that's, Netanyahu is spectacularly articulate. He has survived for 17 months after being the person on whose watch October the 7th happened. And he's a very, very smart politician. I would imagine that he is acutely aware that this demand of his coalition partners of maintaining and enshrining in law the exclusion from the military service is politically perhaps his most potentially most significant vulnerability.
Okay. And finally, let's look at protests against Hamas in Gaza, which appear to be growing in number. And Hamas, this morning, I believe it was, made a statement, the Hamas terror movement made a statement that the protesters are actually protesting against Israel, against the renewal of warfare, fearing for their lives. And that's what they're saying. What do we think is actually happening there from our reporting?
What I think we can safely say is that the last two and a bit days of protests in Gaza would seem to be something of a departure. There have been isolated incidents of people. There have been people on camera saying bad things about Hamas, little flickers of protest, right? But the last 2.5 days, certainly Tuesday, Wednesday, we saw larger numbers. We think, again, there's no independent reporting in Gaza. You rely on what people are sending out and what people who are working in a still Hamas-controlled environment are reporting. I'm sure that in the mindset of people who are demonstrating, there is for sure hostility to Israel and hostility to Hamas. I mean, I don't know how to quantify which is dominant. We've heard shouts of Hamas out and other complaints directly addressed to Hamas, and we've heard people saying, really, this is their sentiment is an anti-Israel sentiment. But there's street protest, and some of it at least is overtly directed against Hamas. And we've not seen this kind of thing before. Where does it go? Nobody knows, okay? Anybody who tells you, oh, this is the end for Hamas, or it is absolutely not the end for Hamas, we don't know. 3 days ago, nobody saw this coming. As I've said to you on the podcast, one day Assad is governing Syria, the next day he's, fled to Russia, and different people are running Syria. We can't predict how this is playing out. And we should, be aware of that. But something is going on. It seems to be gathering pace, and we will watch to see where it heads from here. And if you're running Israel, you are, and you have an interest in Hamas being booted out of Gaza, the sooner the better, and utterly marginalized as an ideology, you should be thinking about how you can help give support to anti-Hamas protests without actually undermining them by endorsing them as Israel, right? It's a tightrope. You want to say, great, guys, but the more that Israel says it's great, then the more other people in Gaza who loathe Israel are less likely to join in. So there's a path there, and I hope that smart people are trying to find it.
Okay, we will see how that all plays out. Thank you, David, for all that you explained to us.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.